In our last podcast with Rachel Steratore and Andrew Parker, we learned how RAND conducted one of the largest public alerting surveys ever fielded in the United States. Over 80,000 respondents nationwide, collected within hours of a live national test in 2023. That study revealed that approximately 91% of adults with working cell phones received the alert, demonstrating extraordinary reach. But it also surfaced critical disparities related to geography, device type, age, carrier differences, and opt-out behavior. We explored many topics that related to WIA performance and receipt rates, and touched briefly on the subjects of opt-out rates and alert fatigue. Today, we are digging in deeper. So Rachel and Andy, welcome back to our show.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
So I know whenever we were talking about, the RAND study before, we had more to talk about and the show ended. And so again, thanks for being back. I think we're going to jump right into it. And for those that are listening, if you're not familiar with it, please listen to the first one, the first podcast where we talk about this. And this is really building off of those discussions and things that we haven't talked about, just like Jeannette said. So just to move forward, can we talk more about the who as far as receive the test alert, and like what do we know about people with physical, cognitive, or language-based limitations, and those non-English speakers that we generally don't serve as a whole?
Sure. Let me jump in on that. Let me actually start with break this up into those characteristics of the carriers and the devices that are associated with the WHO, and then the characteristics of the individuals themselves. So we did see differences by which carrier somebody had their device through. So those individuals who were with Verizon reported a lower rate of receipt than those who were with other major carriers. That could be for a variety of different reasons. There could be technical reasons there, but there could also just be familiarity with the way that these different companies communicate with their customers. One of the things that I think is a very important question is, do people know what they see when they're getting a WIA alert? Do they recognize that as part of a system or what it stands for? We also saw differences by the type of phone. And particularly less common brands. People who had less common brands were less likely to report having received the alert. So the Apples, the Samsungs, the Motorola's of the world, those folks were reporting a greater rate. And again, there may be technical and non-technical reasons behind that. One of the things that's very important to us was to understand the type of device that people had. Now, we were reliant, because it was a survey, on it being their self-reports of what they had. But we also relied on the catalogs of devices with, I lock my cats out of the rooms.
I love it.
Rachel's is somewhere around there, I'm sure. One of the things we did is we went through a fairly extensive set of questions asking them what type of phone they have, the one they use most commonly. And then we matched that up using the carrier's websites with the types of phones they have and what type of capability those phones typically ship with respect to WIA. So as your audience may or may not know, there have been several standards for WIA over the time, referred to as 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. Most new phones ship with WIA 3.0 as the standard. And that includes things like being able to receive longer alerts as opposed to just shorter alerts. It includes the ability of very specific geo-targeting. Those were advances that came with the different things. But what we found was that there were a small number that still had phones that we could identify as WIA 1.0 phones. About 2 to 3%, about 10%, another 10% had WIA 2.0 phones. And the rest were largely WIA 3.0 phones, but there were a number that we just couldn't determine because there wasn't clear evidence one way or another. And so there is a question of who owns which type of phone, and that's important because that may not be this wasn't a part of our analysis, but that might not be evenly distributed across the population. We do suspect that some of the less familiar brands are lower cost phones that may have lower capability. Um, Getting into the who question about the individual characteristics. Older adults were less likely to report receiving the alert. And younger adults more likely to receive the alert. This was especially striking with those who are over 65, who had the lowest rates. Um, those folks also had the lowest awareness of WEO. We asked them if they'd heard of the system before. So people over ages 65, and that may have, for instance, contributed to confusion about what that was they were seeing. So um, I could imagine, we don't have direct evidence of this, but I could imagine that could have contributed to the lower rates of receipt or reported rates of receipt. We spent a fair amount of effort with on the topic of disability. We were working with some colleagues at Georgia Tech University. They have a center there that is focused on technology and disability. And it's a nuanced area. There are certain types of disability where folks are early adopters of technology because those technologies are supportive, particularly those individuals who have vision or hearing disabilities. There are others that are that's not the case. Um, when we looked at just disability, we found a slightly lower rate of receipt for those reporting any sort of disability versus those not. But when we controlled for other factors, that largely went away. It seems to be that was accounted for by other factors. We did see some awareness differences in disability, um, but none of that was terribly striking, and that was, I think, in some sense, a comforting finding. Um, what was not less comforting was the effects with respect to rurality. Those individuals, and this was a fairly systematic trend. The more and more rural the area was where you lived, the lower the rate of receipt of the WEO alert, of the test alert. And that, I think, is more concerning, and probably technology related. It's a feature of at least that would be my interpretation of it, of the network in those areas.
Can I
Um,
ask you a
we
quick
did that.
question about that?
Yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely.
just to clarify, when you say, so for those in a rural area, they were less likely to receive it, and that's different than less likely, to recognize what it is, right? It didn't come on my phone, like it didn't arrive. Is that what the survey showed?
To be completely accurate, respondents to our survey who lived in more rural areas were less likely to report having received the alert. So this is still a self-reported receipt, and there may be other things that go into that, but it is. I don't recall if there are rural urban differences in awareness, but familiarity with the system. But there might be, and but there was a fairly striking trend where the system appeared to have lower reach, at least by these self-reports in more rural areas. Um, for non-English speakers, we didn't see particularly strong trends, which again was probably a comforting finding. We alerts right now are primarily English and Spanish. They've been exploring the possibility of extending out to other languages, but we didn't find big effects.
No, I just think that I mean, that's critical information because, like, as someone who sends out these alerts, one of the things that really bugs me when people say is, "Well, I sent it out," and in their minds, hopefully, they're not thinking, "Well, I have just assured my community, that everybody is getting the information." Because with the results of this study, we're able to see that there are some inconsistencies in how the message can be received. And so simply hitting the button to say go and pushing it out may not get the message out as you think it would. But again, having this knowledge that, again, you just shared with us will
So let's
help
say we
alerting
said,
authorities with that. Yeah.
so let's say we send an alert to Western Pennsylvania, and about a snowstorm, like there, we might be concerned that we are reaching older, more rural adults at a lower rate than we are folks in cities or younger folk. And I think that could help inform a layered strategy for getting out the word. If you know that there are going to be gaps there, there may be other ways to account.
I think it's just such an important thing to consider when we've talked a lot about people who choose to turn messages off. And yet we also have these populations that simply aren't even receiving them. And that's a really important finding from the work that you've done. And as you've been talking about people who are rural, we think about people who don't receive the message because they're rural, but there are other things that are also affecting the reasons that people are not receiving messages, and one of those is opting out. And in your research, you found out that this correlates with demographic factors, such as people with lower income, and people who are younger adults. And I wondered, can you talk a little bit about why or who is opting out of alerts, those who have these subsidy programs or people who are younger adults?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in on that one. So, on subsidized phones, this was one of the strongest signals we saw in the data, and reported opt out rates were almost 3 times as high for people who received their phones through subsidy or discount programs. Think programs like Lifeline, which reduced the monthly cost of phone or internet service for qualifying low income households. What's interesting is that the story isn't simply subsidized phones don't receive alerts, because in our results, receipt was actually a little higher for people with subsidized phones. So that runs counter to the idea that subsidy provided phones, if they had lower end device capabilities, would necessarily lead to lower receipt. So my interpretation is this looks less like a pure technology capability problem and more like a user experience, trust, or burden problem potentially. Something about the experience of alerts or the context in which they're received may be pushing people toward opting out for some reason, even though the system is reaching them in these cases. And that's really why, digging deeper on those factors associated with, ownership of subsidized phones within these, data is so important. It may help, show observed differences, not only in opting out, but also in receipt and awareness. We mentioned this in the first podcast too, but I want to say it again here and emphasize that these are correlations and not causal claims. But they're strong enough to justify follow-on research,
Right.
especially, qualitative work to understand sort of the why behind the opt-outs in this group. And, this trend should be a priority because, as Andy started to kind of talk about, lower income groups may be at greater risk, perhaps in emergencies. Opting out, limits their ability to receive certain categories of warnings. Like, these are sorts of questions that we would want to, dive into a little bit more. For younger adults, we do see higher opt out behavior compared with the older age groups that Andy mentioned. I want to be careful about pinning that on any single driver. One interesting marker in the data is awareness. And compared to adults 36 to 65, younger adults age, 18 to 35 were significantly less aware of WIA prior to the national test. Now, again, that doesn't prove, causality here, but it may help explain part of what's going on. If someone isn't familiar with what WIA is, who's behind it, what kinds of alerts it's intended for, they may be more likely to perceive, certain alerts as low utility or irrelevant over time. And that can also feed into, our people opting out. A second plausible explanation might be comfort with phone settings. Younger adults, are often more fluent at managing notifications and toggling off features they don't want, whether that's apps, services, or system settings. So if categories feel more burdensome than they do beneficial, they may be quicker to go into settings and opt out. So operationally, the implication here is quite straightforward that if opt-outs are concentrated among younger adults, it can reduce, the reach of certain alert categories within that demographic. And you could think of younger adults too being highly mobile, moving, between jurisdictions for work, school, travel. And so losing that reach of the system can really matter here. So we really need to figure out the why. Is it relevance, trust, alert, volume, usability? And that's where follow-on work, especially qualitative research, can clarify what's driving that behavior.
Yeah, I love that. As you were talking about people with subsidized phones, I wondered if there is an awareness among people who receive a WIA about the cost to them as the phone owner, that they're not paying for a text message to receive this. And not recognizing that. I mean, WIA is not well understood, and it hasn't, I don't believe, been very well publicized, except for when something goes wrong, and then people talk about those messages that look like an Amber Alert, and people are, it's like, oh, of course I know what you're talking about now. But when they
Right.
arrive on your phone, because of the way that so many of these messages are structured, you, in many times, may have no idea who it's from and why your device is being taken over by some incomplete message. There's
Yeah,
so much
Jeanette.
opportunity for education.
I have to laugh because after our first podcast, a dear friend of mine and somebody who worked on the project with us, Katie Wilson, reached out and said that her sister, who's based in the UK, had listened in, and she's a lay audience, has no background in this. And she found it very educational and enlightening to figure out that, oh, these aren't just text messages. Like, the government doesn't just have a list of phone numbers, right? That they're sending these messages out to. It's broadcast. And so she was even just sharing, the uptick in her knowledge base of like how the system even works, and that she found that fascinating.
Conspiracy theories fly after these large tests. And
I don't know what you're talking about, right? Everybody
yeah,
walking around with their foil cap still.
oh,
Um, but
we actually did some effort to try to collect some of those at the time just to see,
oh,
because we were worried if any of it took off. We wanted to sort of have some basis for sort of the timeline for it. It ended up not. It died back down pretty quickly, but a lot of what you're talking about is that I did want to highlight just, I don't want to dig too much into the methodology of the study, but listeners may wonder if there are demographic differences in opting out, could that affect the demographic differences we're seeing in receipt? And in this case, no, because the specific type of alert that this test went out on is a national alert, is not one that you have the option of opting out of. It's designed if the federal government needs to alert the entire U.S. public about something. It has never been used in practice. It has only been used for tests like this, and only a couple of times. But that wouldn't have affected these results.
well,
Yeah,
I
really
just
important.
I know we're gonna go on. I have to touch on what Rachel said about your friend in the UK. I think it's great that she was listening to it, and talk about education. We talk about the public and how they're educated, but I just want to point out too, we have a lot of emergency managers and alerting authorities, as Jeanette said, who really don't understand this themselves, and yet they're the ones tasked with trying to then provide public education. And I'm not saying it's the blind leading the blind, but let's just say it's those with an incomplete understanding. Is that fair? That are trying to answer questions, which can, I think, cause more confusion.
It's a very complicated system. I get questions that I still can't answer, and I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on it.
Especially when you layer it in with other systems that locally maybe the local jurisdictions may subscribe to, like reverse 911, or it's being rolled into uh, sort of wrappers like what happens in LA County. It's we as are actually part of they sort of they put a wrapper around it with some, I believe, an app that is that it comes out in somewhat different form, a name, at least, or it's described there under a different name. I do think there is an opportunity here, and a practical implication of all of this is setting expectations with the ultimate recipient. So this is what we will do, and this is what it will look like at the time. Um, but your point, Eddie, is an excellent one. That's yet another thing that local officials need to have some expertise on. And I think that, there are professional societies and stuff that can work towards education in that respect and whatever. But I think that there is needs to be some attention to what is this. One of the interesting conversations I had with some of the folks at the federal level who are leading this uh, uh, these systems is wouldn't it be neat if we could figure out a way to incorporate citizen science into our educational system? Imagine some sort of program where you're encouraging when there's a national alert like this, or a local test, or something else, encouraging students to do essentially what we did in our survey as a means of, like, did you get the alert on your phone? When did you get it? What did it look like? Take a screen capture of it. I mean, you could imagine what those projects would look like as an opportunity to learn about this, and as an opportunity for kids to take it back to their parents and teach them.
I love the idea of getting screenshots of what these messages look like on all kinds of devices with all
We
kinds
did
of capabilities. It
all of our
because
team members asked their family members and stuff, and we have a folder of a whole bunch of different what they all look like.
yeah, that's great. I would love to share those sometime. And of course, in the last 2 years since the test, all kinds of new capabilities have rolled out. So those
Mhm.
screens look different.
Yeah,
And they're going to continue to change. And we frankly don't have a good understanding of what things look like until it shows up on someone's phone. And it's like, oh, surprise, there's now maps added. It's like, where did that come from? And if you look hard, you can find information in some devices, information being rolled out, but it's not something that is advertised to our alerting authorities that these changes are coming. And so just having access to those images, I think, would be just a tremendous service to all of those who are issuing messages.
that's a fantastic idea. And there's a little known part of the system is that there are some broad guidelines of what we alerts should look like or contain, but the device manufacturers have a lot of control over the actual implementation. And I think we mentioned this in the last podcast. One of the most striking ones is that with Apple devices, and I think this is still the case. There's a button right on the screen that takes you right to the settings where you can where you can opt out. And lo and behold, opt out rates are greater on most phones. And but it isn't all the same. And I agree with you. Having a quick visual of this, so that diversity and how it's evolved over time would be really useful. Part of the problem is we don't know when these alerts are coming out. And so if we can't tell everybody, take a screen capture right at that time. Um, but uh, but yeah, we did that for the national tests a couple of years.
Well, anyone who's listening, if you get an alert, take a picture of it and send it to us. And we will start creating a repository of all these interesting changes that you can't find unless you actually pay attention at that moment.
No, absolutely. Especially if you don't think it's a good message or you're not sure what happened, send it to us. Um, One thing that I'm looking forward to, because we're going to talk about, potentially future research and everything else, is we talk about we almost always think of a phone. But really, especially as technology is continuing, I know that the iPause team has done a lot of research and a lot of push to get more devices to receive it. And so it's transitioning to more of a WIA capable device, because that alert can go straight to your watch, right? If it's connected to the cell, or if it receives that information. I'm seeing them on fridges. I'm seeing them on different things, and so that WIA capable device should display it. So I mean, they're going to be everywhere. Um, and so with all of the research on the ability to receive the message, and we've talked about that. Did you guys learn anything about the ability to act on a message, or is this a gap that needs to be really looked at in future studies?
It's interesting you asked this. When we first started in on designing that project, one of our colleagues, an engineer, uh, mocked up a failure mode analysis, and what that means is just sort of what all has to go right for this thing to work. Where are the places where it could go wrong? A long chain of these things. And as I recall, the last of it was the being an engineer, I presume, most of those boxes and most of those failure points were engineer failure points. And the last box was, of course, people, and that's the biggest failure point. But it was but it was a my immediate reaction was you could do the same thing from the point at which from the device in person, just like person part of this. So you could ask yourself, was the device turned on? Did the device receive the alert? Those are sort of the two device parts of it. Did the person notice? Did they understand what they were receiving? Did they trust what they were receiving? Did the person have any response options available to them? And what do they think about it after the fact? Like, how does that feed into the next one? Their experience. And those are each points at which you could do research, or you could investigate what are the levers, what are the sources of uncertainty there? What are the levers that we have to try to improve the relationship between receiving an alert and actually acting upon it in a way that is helpful to yourself and to everybody else? Um, the study we conducted wasn't able to look at that because first and foremost, it was a test alert. There wasn't an action to be taken at that point. I think this speaks to an important gap here, which is to understand these same sort of dynamics in real events with real alerts. And that's tricky, um, but it's doable. We could also do this in, possibly laboratory studies, or definitely in more tightly controlled experimental environments. Those are research methods that we understand and could do to try to start to get at this part of the problem, which is understanding where things can go wrong from the point at which the person receives it and notices it, to them doing what they need to do to protect themselves, or not, if that's the right answer.
I'm excited to think more about how we can study some of those things. There's been various experiments that have attempted to tap into some of those different angles that you were talking about. I don't know if you're aware of the study that was done at UCLA that was an experiment where people received a wireless emergency alert for a shooting while they were in a lab setting, and they were doing skin conductance and heart rate testing. And
Oh,
it was really interesting that the IRB allowed that project to move forward.
I'm I'm
um,
I'm curious as to how were they actually real alerts, or were these devices that were mocked up to look like theirs?
They did not describe the inclusion of the sound in any of the write-up, which makes me think that it wasn't actually a WIA. It was more like a text message that arrived
I
because,
I, I was just wondering how are they allowed to use the Wii system to do this?
yeah,
But
yeah,
I could imagine how they could run a program that mocked it into
right.
devices that were completely controlled within the lab.
Yeah, yeah. But I loved the premise of it. It's a little scary to do a active shooter situation in a college lab. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's just one of our initial insights that was collected as though it was a real event. And there's certainly many other ways that we can collect that kind of data. But one of the things you were talking about, Andy, that I want to actually turn to Rachel about was about the different perceptions that you might measure. And Rachel, in our last conversation, we talked a little bit about human cognition and how that affects and contributes to risk perception that might factor the way that people respond to warning messages. Well, it does affect how people respond, but could you talk about that a little bit from your academic perspective, so our audience understands better about risk perception and measuring those things?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And you're right. This is, a bit outside of what we directly measured in the RAND study, but when I say risk perception, I'm talking about how people identify a hazard, how they mentally weight it, and how they decide what it means for them. How likely is it, how severe it could be, and what they should do about it. So, a useful way to think about what drives risk perception comes from classic work in the risk perception literature, that people's judgments often cluster around two big dimensions: unknown and dread. And so when a risk feels unfamiliar or hard to understand or uncertain, it has a high unknown characteristic. And when it feels scary or catastrophic or out of one's control or has a high dread factor, people tend to judge it as a higher risk inherently. And there's a classic illustration of some of this in some of the early studies in the 70s, found that microwave ovens were perceived as relatively high risk because they were new and people were uneasy about microwaves in their households. And then you repeat a study like that today, and microwave ovens rank very low on risk perception scales because they're familiar. People have a stable mental model for them. So that's a good, reminder that familiarity changes cognition and affect, or how people feel about something over time. Cognition is sort of that part where how people are thinking about the risk and their mental model of the hazard and what they believe will happen, what they believe the warning means. Whereas affect is, how they're feeling about that risk, whether it's fear, urgency, anger, skepticism, annoyance, whatever it may be. So those two pieces don't solely determine behavior, but they do help shape how someone, receives a warning message, internalizes it. And if a warning lands in a context where the hazard feels, both real, personally relevant, and the message is clear and actionable, then probably more likely to act. And if it lands in a different context where it feels ambiguous or distant or repetitive, people may discount it and delay action or look for confirmation elsewhere. So for warning messages, a big part of effectiveness is aligning it with those human factors, reducing the unknown component by making messages clearer and more interpretable, and channeling that kind of dread type factor into specific actions rather than leaving people kind of feeling paralyzed or disengaged. So those are kind of some of the things I was alluding to in our last chat about those two dimensions and how they influence not only how people perceive a risk, but then how does that translate into action in real time. So two big important factors.
Yeah. Well, they're so important to consider as you think about the next stages for research, as you actually measure the response to taking action or to turning messages off because they're related to those perceptions that you were just describing. People's tolerance for risk, people's judgments about it, their prior experiences, how dreaded
Yeah.
something is. So all of that is background that is really important for those next questions that I think that you want to answer, that moves away from the correlations into the why and the how. And so thank you for sharing that with us, because those are really important dimensions to understand.
Well, can we just ask a fun question to you now? I mean, we've had discussions about, what you think the next steps for research can be, um, the hypotheses and um, other things, developed in relation to the data. Now, I guess my fun question is, if you could pick something next to research based on this, like the next step, and it is, I guess, for each of you, what do you like? What would you go for? What would your next research project be in relation to this? And then what's the best way to go about doing it?
Yeah. Maybe I'll jump in first. Andy and I, when we talked about this, we broke it up into kind of what are some of the next steps or hypotheses we're interested in. And then the second bit of that being like, how do you do that? So I'll start to address maybe parts of the first one, or at least things that are interesting to me. So Andy, you can, jump in and add where you see fit. But a top priority in my mental model is disentangling what's really driving opt-out behavior. Right now, we can see strong correlations by geography, alerting patterns, the subsidy phones, age, but we don't yet know which levers matter most. And that part matters because it's much easier to do something about opt-outs when you know what buttons to push. Is it alert frequency? Is it geographic overreach, message relevance, timing, trust? The list goes on. And so until we start to separate those drivers, we're guessing about which interventions, educated guessing, I will say, um, on what will, is actually reducing disengagement or improving engagement. So that's one. The second big thing that comes to mind would be learning more about this awareness piece. So some other research shows too, as we were talking about education, is like in most cases, if a topic is highly scientific or technical, lay public or non-specialists don't always need to know all of the technical details in order to make informed decisions related to that risk or technical, issue. But there would be key features that they would need to know, and that is discovered through doing research, figuring out what some of those key elements would be that they would need to know to make some of those risk-informed decisions. So in this study, awareness floated a little bit into the background because receipt and opt-out were such urgent, system performance questions. But in many ways, awareness is that untold part of the story. We can confirm that, most people are receiving alerts. We can work on minimizing opt-outs, but if a large share of the public doesn't know what WIA is or who's behind it, why it exists, we're missing, like a big piece of that system effectiveness there. So low awareness cannot likely feed into low trust or perceived relevance, perhaps disengagement. So you can see there's like a string of concepts or constructs that are related that we need to find out, more about. And one more maybe that would come to mind is shifting from did the alert arrive to did the alert feel useful? We now have, good evidence that the system can technically reach people at scale. That was like the point or one of the big points of the study. But that next layer is perceived, utility when the alert arrives. Do you feel that it helps you make better decisions? Does it clarify risk? Does it support action? Or does it just feel like, more noise buzzing on your phone? And that's where, as I mentioned, more qualitative work too, and it doesn't have to just be qualitative work, but that's, a big piece of this that we couldn't address in this primarily quantitative survey.
Hey,
But things
Rachel,
like interviews, deep, focus
for our
groups,
no, and I don't want
discussions.
to stop you, but
Yeah,
I want to help everybody understand. You're using words qualitative, quantitative. For everybody out there who is
yeah,
not a doctorate, who doesn't have their doctorate, what are the can you talk about the differences, but just even between those? Because a
sure.
question I have gotten is, well, why couldn't you check for all those things, right, in this study? And
Hmm.
because it is very narrowed,
Sure,
but just to help break it down for
sure.
the rest of us in the room.
Yes. And I'll try to break it down both by how you do these different types of research. So quantitative again, these aren't perfect definitions, but for just a general audience, the quantitative part is more number crunching. We want to be able to use a survey to say something generalizable about a bigger population, but we only have a sample. So we're going to be a little more quantitative in that 91% of people received the alert. The qualitative part of that would be talking to the 10% or a portion of the 10% that didn't receive the alert, do a deeper in-depth interview, say, or a focus group amongst, a group of people that didn't receive it, and start to disentangle the reasons why, what factors drove their decisions to opt out, what sort of, awareness levels do they have? What's their background? Like all of these deeper questions of digging into the why and the factors can be done in, say, a qualitative interview versus something that's targeted at just more descriptive aggregation of information. So quantitative, think 91% received, qualitative being, let's actually talk to people and get a deeper understanding for these factors involved. So that's kind of a high level piece there. So with that, I think it's worth restating, what we said last time about the public needing to be a partner and empowered to make these decisions for their own, safety and emergency response options. So I would summarize all of that with the next research phase is disentangle what's driving opt-out, elevate awareness from sort of a background variable to a core outcome, and start measuring not just reach, but utility and trust. And I think Andy's going to dive a little bit more into some thoughts we have about the how.
One of the things when and Jeannette, you probably have had this experience as well. One of the things when you do research around emergencies and disasters and emerging events is that most of that isn't announced ahead of time. Most alerting doesn't have a lot of advance warning because the events that they're alerting about don't have a lot of advance warning. If we're talking about a hurricane, sure, we may have several days of build up to that, but if it's a tornado outbreak, probably not. And if it's a flash flood, perhaps not. And or other events. And so it's and even when you're talking about a hurricane, your advance warning is about a week. In typical research timelines, that's not much time at all. And so the work that we do in this space is often quite different from the pre-planned study that we did around this national test, which we knew was happening, in our case, years in advance. And it was, so we were able to sort of design the study to get this big sample, to do it quickly, to tell people who we were going to survey ahead of time, you're going to get this survey and it's real and and it's important that you respond to it quickly because we want to get your memory. We don't want to, have to rely too much on memory. But what we really care about, honestly, is how this works in the real world. And that requires a different approach. Most disaster research is reactive. Something bad happens and we quickly mobilize to get out there and collect information as quickly as possible. You can't very well do disasters in a laboratory. That's hard and questionable sometimes. So it's so one of the things that has gotten us thinking about a lot is the need to invest in infrastructure. If we're talking about physical science, there are sensing networks for earthquakes or tsunamis. There are the National Weather Service is a sensing network in many ways. There are and we can track historical trends and we can do have a lot of data streams that are coming in. When it comes to the human problem, when it comes to social and behavioral science, where we're coming, we don't have that infrastructure for the most part. But we could really use it. And what would that be? Well, first off, we need to ask somebody these questions. We need to collect these data from somebody. Having that collection, that sample readily available to us in advance would be useful. And there are standing survey panels that can play this role. We actually tapped into some of those for our study, but they could be used in a more real-time way if we prepared in advance for this. One of the things that's really intriguing about that is a challenge of doing research immediately after something bad happens is it can be incredibly tone deaf. It can come across as creepy and ghoulish and why are you asking me these questions when I'm trying to just survive? But if this person has been recruited well in advance and we said when something happens, we're going to call you because your experience is important, and we're going to pay you for your time. Put some money in your pocket while you're trying to do this, and we're gonna and we're gonna and we're gonna ask you questions that are gonna feed into real policy and real responses. Give them a reason why they should participate. Suddenly, that survey or that phone call or whatever it is doesn't feel out of place. So, getting that group of people, we need assessment tools in advance that are ready to go. We need analytic plans and communication plans that are ready to go. That's all. We know how to do that. It's not a small endeavor, by any means, but I think that we've been moving towards sort of thinking about this as what would be the social science equivalent of the sensing network? What would be the social science equivalent of the testing lab? What would be the social science equivalent of historical data? These are I think are questions that would help really move forward in this space in a more data-driven way. Um, think about the benefits of this. We capture public experience and response as it happens, rather than relying on people's memories, which are faulty. Um, we can quickly identify gaps, for instance, in information or options or resources that emergency management can respond to. uh, we could systematically document what happens in a way that we can learn from it after the fact in a better way. And I could go on about that, but I do think that uh, it's important, and we've said this several times, that the public is an incredibly important partner in any emergency response. And if we ignore the public experience, and the public and their understanding and their behavior and all of that, all of our understanding of the engineered system here is just going to run into this brick wall of ignorance around how the public act. What did the public actually do? We don't want to treat them as a black box. We know how to actually start on.
I think those are great ideas. We have done quick response research for so many decades as part of disaster scholarship, going into the field to collect that perishable data. But a broader survey where you have human social sensors that are prepared to respond immediately would reduce so much burden on the researcher of getting into the field. Plus, you just can't get there to collect this kind of data quickly enough. So setting those up ahead of time would be ideal.
I love the term scientific readiness.
Mm.
It is accompanied to operational readiness. And we have colleagues who have thought a lot about this. Lori Peak and her crew, for example, in Colorado, have been really pushing some of this. But I do think having standing capability is, and you pointed to another thing about infrastructure. It if you do this right, it becomes a resource that lots of different scientists can tap into. It's the my economist friends would say you're sort of absorbing the fixed costs, that and not making every group reinvent that part of it. When COVID-19 hit, NSF released a call for rapid proposals, and many groups submitted proposals to do work in this space. And even within the program, I I've worked with and Rachel's worked with. We know several of the groups. We were part of that, and a lot of us had to go through the same exercise of very quickly trying to stand up data collection and doing all this stuff. And after the fact, I'm sort of like, that was so redundant.
Yeah, yeah. That was an incredible effort. And like you were saying, not only is it challenging for the researchers to get the people to tap into it, but if everyone was trying to go to the same community, then you've got people who are completely overwhelmed by scientists coming in and asking them similar questions over and over again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And for anybody who's out there who's thinking, again, it's the question of, well, you guys didn't ask this, or you didn't ask, something else, or we don't have a certain piece. There was still a ton of information that was collected, that has been analyzed. And there are really way too many variables out there to do them all at once anyway. And it's going to take, as Rachel said, subsequent studies. And one thing, Andy, I really like what you said, and it's just a reminder to everybody out there who's like, well, why don't we have more information? And as I guess, as a caveat, we, thanks to this study, have a lot more information than we ever have in the past. But people are too busy surviving often to do that rapid response. And this was in statistics class I took for my undergraduate. I remember it was a professor who made a comment. He's like, well, I'd like to know more about the process of somebody dying, but they're too busy to respond. And it really, if you think your tornado example and others, when we're in the moment, it is really difficult to gather that data. And I guess to that, I am really impressed with just the amount of data that you guys were able to get. And I look forward to new and interesting ways, as you guys were talking about, of collecting more data as we pass through other types of hazards, which they will happen. And I hope we are able to get that to answer all of the other questions. I swear, Rachel, I want a little graphic with all these levers, because I swear you pull one and then you're like, well, I didn't get the response I needed. So then you reach for another one.
Yeah.
It'll be huge once we get all that information.
Well, this has been, again, another great conversation. I love talking with my colleagues in research, and you bring such a special perspective of having done this really massive, incredible national study, which was really a service to the nation. So thank you for your work in this area and for bringing all of this knowledge to our listeners and to our readers and to our watchers. And for everyone who's listening and watching, please like and subscribe and share this podcast with others so that we can get this information farther to the people who really need it. So thanks, Andy and Rachel, for joining us again today.
Thank you
Always
for
happy
doing
to
that.
chat.
Just thank you. And again, download their study, get it, and you'll see links to it, um, and apply what it's showing us. Apply the results to make your programs better.